You are no longer part of this family. We will move on without you. Do not come back. Those were the exact words glowing on my phone screen in the dead of night. My own son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders. The man I had entrusted with the keys to my life's work. He had just erased me with a few careless taps of his thumb. I sat there in the heavy silence of a sterile, unfamiliar hotel room on the outskirts of Dallas, the harsh light of the screen reflecting off my tired eyes. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not shatter the bedside lamp in a fit of rage. I simply stared at the message, took a long, slow breath, and typed a single word in reply. Okay. I hit send. Then I placed the device face down on the cheap veneer nightstand. The silence that followed was suffocating, but my mind was moving with crystal-clear precision. Derek thought he had won. He and his wife Megan firmly believed they had successfully discarded a helpless 75-year-old man. They thought that by locking me out of my own home earlier that day and shoving a forged medical power of attorney in my face, they had completely stripped me of my power. They looked at my gray hair and my recent hospital bracelet and saw weakness. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that I built the commercial real estate empire they were trying to steal from the dirt up. They forgot exactly who they were dealing with. I reached into my worn leather travel bag and pulled out my heavy encrypted laptop. I flipped it open, the blue light casting long, sharp shadows across the peeling wallpaper of the room. My hands weathered from decades of shaking hands with rough contractors signing multi-million-dollar land deals and walking the concrete floors of massive warehouses across Texas, did not shake at all. I opened my private secure terminal. I picked up my phone again and dialed the 24-hour wealth management hotline for my private bank. When you control the kind of liquid capital I do, someone always answers before the second ring. A polite, alert voice came on the line. Mr. Harrison, good evening. How can we assist you tonight? I took another deep breath, grounding myself. I need to initiate a level 4 total asset freeze on the primary corporate portfolio and all associated subsidiary accounts. I said, my voice steady, cold, and echoing slightly in the empty room. The representative paused for a fraction of a second. I could hear the faint clicking of his keyboard, likely seeing the massive 8-figure numbers lighting up on his own monitor. Sir, I just need to verify your security protocols for a freeze of this magnitude. This will suspend all outgoing wires, disable all corporate credit lines, and lock the escrow accounts. Are you certain you wish to proceed? I am certain. I gave him my alphanumeric passcodes. I answered the layered security questions. I authorized the biometric lock through the encrypted app on my phone. In less than 3 minutes, the financial lifeblood of a 30-year-old empire was completely cut off. Every corporate platinum card in Derek's wallet, every liquid cash account he thought he controlled, every line of credit attached to the Harrison name was frozen solid. Not a single dollar could be moved without my physical presence, my voice print, and my signature. Derek had sent that cruel text message thinking he was cutting me out of his life so he could finally enjoy the millions he believed he had stolen. He had no idea that while he was likely pouring expensive champagne in my living room celebrating his supposed victory with Megan, I was quietly pulling the plug on his entire reality. I closed the laptop with a soft click and leaned back in the stiff hotel chair. For the first time all day, a small, grim smile touched my lips. I poured myself a glass of tap water from the bathroom sink, letting the cold liquid soothe my dry, tight throat. I had just survived a mild stroke a few weeks ago. The specialists at the clinic told me to avoid stress. They told me to rest and let my family take care of me. Derek was supposed to be running the company honorably while I recovered. Instead, he used my medical emergency as an opportunity to forge legal documents, bribe a corrupt doctor, and try to throw me away into an assisted living facility. He wanted me out of the way so badly that he changed the locks on the custom-built estate I paid for in cash 40 years ago. But this was not about resting anymore. This was about absolute survival. This was about protecting my legacy from a parasite that just happened to share my blood. I looked over at my phone resting silently on the nightstand. It was quiet for now, but I knew the storm that was coming. Oh, the trap was set. The accounts were locked. The poison pill I had buried in my company's operating agreement years ago was fully armed and waiting. If you are listening to this story right now, and you understand what it feels like to be betrayed by the very people you gave your whole life to, please hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It helps me to know that I am not alone in this fight. Let me take you back to just 72 hours before this moment. 72 hours before I sat in this dim hotel room and froze my own life's work. 72 hours before the illusion of my perfect family shattered into a million jagged pieces. Because by the time the sun came up the next morning, my phone screen would be glowing again. Not with a dismissive text message, but with 43 desperate missed calls from a son who had just realized he was trapped in a cage of his own making. But by then, it would be entirely too late. The first rays of dawn broke through the gap in the cheap hotel curtains, casting a harsh, pale light across the foot of the bed. I had not slept a single wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the text message repeating in my mind like a broken record. My eyes were heavy, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. At exactly 6 in the morning, the silence of the room was shattered by a sharp, aggressive buzzing. I turned my head slowly toward the nightstand. The screen of my phone was blindingly bright, flashing a name I had once spoken with nothing but pride. Derek. I watched the phone vibrate against the fake wood grain, inching its way toward the edge. I did not reach for it. I simply sat there in the quiet and let it ring. It stopped for a brief moment, only to start up again 3 seconds later. Then again, and again. I reached over, unlocked the screen, and saw the notification banner. 43 missed calls. 43 desperate attempts to reach the man he had just banished from his life. I could almost picture him standing at the airport counter, his face drained of color, his platinum cards rejected the reality of his situation, finally crashing down on his arrogant shoulders. He was trapped. The empire he thought he had stolen was nothing but a locked vault, and I was the only one holding the key. I swiped the notification away and set the phone back down. I was not ready to speak to him. Let him sweat. Let him pace the airport terminal in pure panic. Let him feel a fraction of the deep, suffocating helplessness he tried to force upon me just a few hours prior. If you are connecting with my story so far, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and whether you have ever experienced the deep, hollow ache of being betrayed by someone who shares your blood. Your support means the world to me. Now, to truly understand the sheer audacity of those 43 missed calls, you need to know how this nightmare began. Let me take you back to just 72 hours ago, back to a time when I still thought I had a son who loved me. 3 days earlier, the world felt entirely different. I was sitting on the edge of a pristine white bed in an upscale rehabilitation clinic in North Dallas. The lingering scent of sterile alcohol wipes and lavender air freshener hung in the room. 2 weeks prior, a sudden frightening tightness in my chest and a numbness in my left arm had landed me in the emergency room. A mild stroke, the doctors called it. A warning shot from my own body telling me to slow down after 50 years of relentless grinding work. But my recovery had been remarkably fast. My speech was perfect. My motor skills were fully intact. The physical therapist was amazed by my progress, noting that my stubbornness was probably the only thing keeping me going. That morning, my primary care physician walked in with a warm, reassuring smile and a signed clipboard. He told me I was clearing the final neurological tests with flying colors and that I was free to go home 2 days ahead of schedule. I felt a surge of profound relief. All I wanted was to sleep in my own bed, sit in my own leather chair, and look out over the gardens I had planted with my late wife. I decided not to call Derek or Megan to pick me up. They had been visiting me, putting on a show of deep concern, bringing expensive fruit baskets, and talking endlessly about how they were handling the business so I could rest. I wanted to surprise them. I wanted to walk through the front door on my own 2 feet and show them that the old man was still full of life and ready to take the reins back. I packed my small leather duffel bag, signed my discharge papers, and walked out the glass doors of the clinic into the warm Texas sun. I pulled out my phone and ordered a premium ride service. When the black SUV pulled up, I climbed into the back seat, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As we drove down the highway toward my estate, I looked out the tinted window at the sprawling Dallas skyline. I saw the towering glass office buildings and the massive commercial distribution centers dotting the horizon. I had built a significant portion of that landscape. I started with nothing, working 100-hour weeks, sacrificing sleep and comfort to build a real estate portfolio that provided my family with a life of absolute privilege. I gave Derek everything I never had: private schools, luxury cars, a guaranteed executive position at my firm the moment he graduated college. I thought I was being a good father by paving the road for him. I never realized that by removing all the obstacles, I had raised a man who did not understand the value of a single dollar or the meaning of loyalty. The SUV turned off the main road and onto the quiet, tree-lined street of my neighborhood. Massive oak trees cast long, comforting shadows over the manicured lawns. We pulled up to the wrought iron gates of my property. The house sat far back from the street, a beautiful, sprawling custom stone mansion that represented a lifetime of sweat and sacrifice. I thanked the driver, grabbed my bag from the trunk, tipped him generously, and stepped out onto the wide cobblestone driveway. The morning air was fresh, carrying the familiar scent of the blooming magnolias I had planted decades ago. I walked slowly toward the heavy front door, reaching into my pocket for my keys. I was smiling, genuinely eager to see the look of happy surprise on my son's face. I had absolutely no idea I was walking straight into a cruel and calculated ambush. I slid my familiar brass key into the heavy oak door of my home. The lock mechanism, which I had turned thousands of times over the decades, felt stiff. I jiggled the key, assuming the Texas humidity had warped the wood slightly, but it refused to catch. I pulled it out, wiped it on my slacks, and tried again. Nothing. A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. This was the house where I had raised my family. I knew every creak of the floorboards, every groove in the doorframe. The lock had not jammed. It had been completely replaced. I knocked firmly on the thick wood, the sound echoing through the quiet morning. I expected my housekeeper to come rushing to the door. Instead, I heard the heavy footsteps of a man. The deadbolt clicked. The door swung inward, revealing my son Derek. He was dressed in a crisp, expensive designer suit that I had likely paid for holding a cup of artisan coffee. He did not look surprised to see me. He did not smile. He simply stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders physically blocking my entrance. Before I could even speak, Megan stepped up beside him. She was wearing her pristine tennis outfit, looking every bit the flawless, wealthy housewife she pretended to be. She did not offer a hug. Instead, she tilted her head and gave me a sickeningly sweet, patronizing smile. The kind of smile one might give a confused child. She asked what I was doing here, her voice dripping with fake concern. She reminded me that I was not supposed to be discharged until Friday. I looked past them, trying to see into my own foyer. I asked where my housekeeper was, my voice steady but carrying a sharp edge. I demanded to know why my key did not work on my own front door. I told Derek to step aside, explaining that I was tired and wanted to sit in my living room. Derek did not move a single inch. He took a slow sip of his coffee and looked down at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He told me smoothly that I could not come in. His voice lacked any warmth or hesitation. I felt my blood pressure begin to rise, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his words. I reminded him that I built this house, that I paid for the very ground he was standing on, and I ordered him to move out of my way. Megan placed a gentle, restraining hand on his arm, stepping slightly forward to deliver the poison. She told me not to get upset, claiming it was bad for my heart. She said they were going to tell me tomorrow. She explained with a chilling calmness that they had moved my things to a premium assisted living facility out in the suburbs. She described it as having round-the-clock, professional care, beautiful gardens, and people my own age to talk to. She boasted that they had paid for the best suite available. She looked me in the eye and said that I needed professional care now that I had just suffered a stroke, and that it was time for me to rest and let Derek handle the stress of the business. I stared at her, the words washing over me like ice water. Assisted living. I was a 75-year-old man who ran a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate firm. I had just walked out of a rehabilitation clinic with a clean bill of health. My mind was sharp enough to negotiate complex zoning laws and corporate mergers. I did not need a nurse to feed me. I needed my son to step aside. I dropped my voice to a low, dangerous register and told them this was not a negotiation. I stated clearly that they do not pack up my belongings and ship me off to a retirement home without my consent. I ordered them out of my doorway before I called the local police and had them both removed from my property for trespassing. Derek let out a short, hollow laugh. It was a sound that chilled me to the bone. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a neatly folded stack of thick legal papers. He flicked them open with his wrist and held them up to the morning light, just out of my reach. He warned me not to call the police, his tone shifting from dismissive to openly hostile. He stated matter-of-factly that if the police showed up, they were not going to arrest him or his wife. They were going to escort me directly to a psychiatric ward. My eyes scanned the heavy black text on the top of the document. Power of attorney. Below it, attached with a brass staple, was a medical certificate bearing the letterhead of the hospital where I had just spent the last 2 weeks. I squinted, reading the bold letters summarizing my diagnosis. Advanced cognitive decline. Dementia. The signature at the bottom belonged to a neurologist I had seen exactly once during my first night in the intensive care unit. I felt the ground tilt beneath my feet. I demanded to know what this was, my hands balling into fists at my sides. I called it a complete fabrication. I told them my primary physician had just cleared me an hour ago, that I had a mild heart issue, not dementia. Megan sighed, dramatically shaking her head. She pointed out to Derek that I was confused again. She claimed the doctors had warned them I might have these aggressive episodes and memory lapses. I snapped at her to stop talking to me like I was a stray dog. I asserted that I knew my own mind, and I firmly stated that I never signed a power of attorney giving them control of my life or my assets. Derek stepped closer to the threshold, his height looming over me. He whispered that I did a cruel smirk, twisting his lips. He claimed I signed it 3 days ago, boasting that they even had a notary present. My mind raced backward, desperately searching through the haze of the past few days. I remembered a Tuesday afternoon. The pain medication had been particularly strong that day, leaving me drowsy and disoriented. Derek had come into my hospital room holding a stack of clipboards. He had told me they were routine insurance authorization forms required by the clinic to keep my private suite covered. He had guided my hand to the dotted lines, assuring me he was just taking care of the boring administrative details so I could sleep. He had used my trust, my absolute vulnerability, to steal my sovereignty. The gravity of the betrayal settled heavily onto my chest. I looked at the boy I had raised, the son I had given every advantage in life, and I told him he had tricked me. I realized he had sat by my hospital bed, held my hand, and robbed me blind while I was sedated. Derek shot back that he was protecting the family assets from a man who was clearly past his prime. His eyes hardened with greed as he accused me of planning to work until I dropped dead and taking the company down with me. He claimed he was just accelerating the inevitable. He proudly declared that the papers were ironclad. He explained that the corrupt doctor testified my stroke had severely impaired my judgment and the notary had witnessed my signature. He gloated that he controlled the real estate firm, the bank accounts, and the house. He then delivered his final threat. He told me that if I took one step across the threshold, he would dial emergency services right then and there. He would tell the dispatcher that his father, a dementia patient, had wandered away from his care facility and was becoming violent. He promised they would put me in a state-run facility on a psychiatric hold, and I would never see the outside of a padded room again. I stood there on the cobblestone driveway, the warm Texas sun beating down on my shoulders, yet I had never felt so cold. I was staring into the eyes of a monster I had created. He had orchestrated this perfectly. He had the medical documents, the legal authority, and the physical possession of my home. If I caused a scene, if I yelled or fought back, I would only be playing right into their narrative. I would look exactly like the crazy, confused old man they claimed I was on paper. Megan stood behind him, her arms crossed her face, a mask of smug satisfaction. The silence stretched out between us, thick and suffocating. A lesser man might have broken down right there. A lesser man might have fallen to his knees and begged his own flesh and blood for mercy, pleading for a corner of his own house to die in. But as I looked at Derek's arrogant smirk, the initial shock gave way to something else entirely. A profound, icy clarity washed over my mind. He thought a few forged signatures and a bribed doctor were enough to dismantle a man who had survived cutthroat corporate wars for 40 years. He had the paperwork, but he lacked the intelligence to understand the true depth of what he was trying to steal. I did not scream. I did not throw a punch. I did not give them a single ounce of the satisfaction they were craving. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying my racing heart. I adjusted the strap of my leather duffel bag on my shoulder and looked my son dead in the eyes. I saw the slight flicker of uncertainty behind his bravado. He expected a fight. He expected a mental breakdown. My calm demeanor unnerved him. I turned my back on them without another word. I walked away from the massive oak door down the wide cobblestone path and out through the wrought iron gates of my own estate. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, but I did not look over my shoulder. I pulled out my phone and ordered another car, directing it to the nearest business hotel. They thought I was retreating to accept defeat. They thought they had successfully exiled me to a life of quiet desperation in a nursing home. But as I sat in the back of the car, watching my neighborhood disappear in the rearview mirror, my grief hardened into a weapon. They had no idea that their plausible little lie was just the opening move in a game they could never hope to win. The Blacktown car rolled quietly through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, taking me away from the only home I had known for 4 decades. I stared out the tinted window, watching the manicured lawns blur past. I knew exactly what was happening back at the estate. Derek and Megan were likely standing in my grand foyer right now, pouring themselves a glass of my most expensive scotch, clinking their crystal glasses in a victorious toast. They believed my silence on the driveway was a sign of total defeat, an admission that I was too weak, sick, and tired to fight back against their brilliant legal maneuver. It is a dangerous thing to underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose but his pride. Their arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. They assumed I operated like they did, relying on loud threats and messy public confrontations to get what I wanted. But I had spent my life negotiating in the shadows, anticipating my opponents 3 steps ahead, and striking only when the odds were completely in my favor. You do not build a commercial real estate empire by throwing tantrums on a front porch. You build it by mastering the art of the silent, calculated strike. I pulled my phone from my pocket and instructed the driver to take me to a specific business hotel downtown, one where the corporate suites offered high-speed encrypted internet lines. 20 minutes later, I stood at the reception desk. The clerk handed me a keycard with a smile, unaware that the elderly man before him had been rendered homeless by his own flesh and blood. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor and walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway. When I pushed open the door to my room, the space felt entirely devoid of warmth. It was a standard corporate suite, decorated in muted gray and beige tones, featuring a heavy wooden desk facing a large window that overlooked the sprawling Dallas skyline. It was a far cry from the custom oak paneling and plush leather of my home office, but it would serve its purpose perfectly. This was no longer a place to rest. This room was about to become my absolute command center. I dropped my leather duffel bag onto the edge of the pristine king-sized bed and walked straight over to the desk. I did not bother unpacking my clothes or turning on the television. I did not even take off my suit jacket. My physical exhaustion from the hospital discharge had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, burning adrenaline that pumped fiercely through my veins. The grief of losing my son to greed sat heavy in my chest, but I pushed it down, burying it beneath sheer determination. There would be plenty of time to mourn the death of my family later. Right now, I had an empire to protect. I unzipped the side compartment of my bag and pulled out my laptop. It was a heavy military-grade machine, custom-built for my specific security needs. I plugged the power adapter into the wall outlet and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my face. I connected to the secure network and brought up the primary login portal for Harrison Commercial Real Estate and Logistics. The familiar corporate logo, a steel bridge I sketched on a napkin 30 years ago, greeted me. I typed in my standard executive username and password. The screen loaded for a fraction of a second before flashing a bright red error message. Access denied. Account suspended. I let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Derek had actually done it. He had wasted no time. The moment he forced that forged power of attorney through, he must have instructed the IT department to lock me out of the front-end system. He probably felt incredibly smart, thinking he had completely severed my connection to the company's nervous system. But Derek was a vice president who had been handed his title on a silver platter. He only knew how to operate the machinery, not how it was built. He did not know that 10 years ago, when we upgraded our entire digital infrastructure, I had personally sat down with our lead network architect and quietly mandated the creation of a ghost protocol. It was an invisible, untraceable backdoor access point buried deep within the server code, designed specifically for a catastrophic emergency. An emergency like a hostile internal takeover. I closed the main portal window and opened a blank command terminal. The screen turned pitch black, waiting for manual input. I cracked my knuckles in the silent hotel room and began to type. Line after line of complex code filled the screen, bypassing the standard firewalls and weaving through the security protocols Derek thought were impenetrable. The terminal demanded a secondary biometric verification. I pressed my thumb against the scanner on the keyboard. A green light flashed. The system authenticated my identity, and suddenly the digital walls came tumbling down. The heavy black screen melted away, replaced by the raw, unfiltered master dashboard of my entire corporate network. Every bank account, every pending real estate contract, every internal corporate email, and every single cent of my liquid capital was laid out perfectly before me in real time. I was inside. Derek had locked the front door of the house, but he had completely forgotten to check the cellar. The digital footprint of my company was massive, but I knew exactly where to look. I navigated straight to the executive transaction logs, filtering the data to show only activity from the past 14 days, the exact duration of my hospital stay. I needed to see exactly what my son had been doing while I was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for my life. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen as the server processed my request. The hunt for the truth had officially begun. The data materialized on the screen in neat glowing rows of numbers. To anyone else, it would look like an endless, boring spreadsheet of corporate accounting. But to me, these numbers were the vital signs of the empire I had built. I could read the health of my company and the flow of capital, the timing of the payroll transfers, and the rhythm of the operational expenses. I leaned closer to the monitor, the harsh light reflecting in my eyes, and began to scroll through the executive transaction logs from the exact moment my ambulance had pulled away from the corporate office 2 weeks ago. I expected to see signs of incompetence. I fully anticipated finding bloated expense reports, maybe a frivolous company car purchase, or a ridiculous executive bonus Derek had authorized for himself the second he thought I was out of the picture. I was prepared for greed. I was not prepared for what was staring back at me. I opened the primary operating ledger, the account we used to handle daily contractor payments and property maintenance. The balance was shockingly low. I frowned, highlighting a block of transactions dated just 3 days after my stroke. There was a wire transfer for $50,000. The recipient was a vendor name I did not recognize, an entity with a generic title that had no prior history in our system. I dug deeper, pulling up the attached digital invoice. It was a crude, vaguely worded bill for consulting services. My jaw tightened. Derek had not even tried to make it look convincing. 2 days later, there was another transfer. $75,000 routed to a different unknown account. Then $100,000. Then another $100,000. The transfers were happening almost every other day, bleeding the operating account dry with reckless abandon. I pulled up the master calculator application and started feeding the numbers into it. The clacking of my laptop keys echoed in the silent hotel room, a steady beat of impending disaster. 50,000, plus 75, plus 100, plus another 120. The total climbed higher and higher, a digital monument to my son's absolute betrayal. When I finally hit the enter key on the last transaction logged yesterday afternoon, the final number sat heavy and cold on the screen. Over $500,000 in pure liquid cash had vanished from the corporate accounts in 14 days. $500,000 completely evaporated. I sat back in the stiff hotel chair and rubbed my tired eyes. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. This was not the work of a spoiled heir buying luxury watches or throwing lavish parties. You do not siphon $500,000 in untraceable wire transfers across 2 weeks just to live a lavish lifestyle. This was a frantic and uncoordinated scramble. The chaotic spacing of the transfers, the sloppy fake invoices, the sheer volume of cash moving so quickly, it all painted a specific and terrifying picture. Derek was not just greedy. Derek was utterly terrified. I leaned forward again, my mind racing through the possibilities. In the world of high stakes real estate, $500,000 is a substantial amount of liquid cash, but it is not retirement money. It is not enough to abandon a multi-million-dollar company for. Which meant this stolen cash was not a nest egg. It was a bandage. Derek was trying to plug a massive bleeding hole somewhere else. He was throwing corporate cash into a fire, trying to buy himself time. But time for what? Who was he paying? And why was the panic so evident in his digital footprint? The gut feeling that had been gnawing at the edge of my consciousness since I stood on my front porch crystallized into a sharp and undeniable certainty. Kicking me out of my own home and forcing that fraudulent power of attorney was not the endgame. It was merely the prerequisite. Derek had not locked me out because he wanted to sit in my chair and run the company. He had locked me out because he was in desperate and immediate trouble, and he needed absolute unchecked access to the company's deepest pockets to save his own skin. He needed me declared mentally incompetent, so I could not step in and stop the bleeding before he finished whatever catastrophic maneuver he was attempting. I stared at the blinking cursor, a profound sense of sorrow mingling with the cold anger. My son was not just a thief. He was a drowning man, and he was using my life's work as a raft fully prepared to pull me under the water to keep himself afloat. The $500,000 was just the beginning. It was the frantic thrashing of a man who realized he was trapped. If he was this desperate, he would not stop at the operating cash. He would go after the heavy assets. He would go after the foundational pillars that held the entire enterprise together. I closed the ledger and opened the master asset portfolio. This was the vault holding the deeds, the long-term investments, and the multi-million-dollar properties. My hands trembled slightly as I navigated the digital security gates. If Derek had breached this level, the damage could be absolutely irreversible. I applied a filter to show any pending contracts, active listings, or recent appraisals initiated within the last 2 weeks. The server took a few seconds to process the heavy data load. The little loading icon spun on the screen, feeling like an eternity. I held my breath, praying my instincts were wrong, praying the damage was confined to the liquid cash. But as the screen refreshed and the new data populated the dashboard, the blood drained completely from my face. The $500,000 was a mere drop in the bucket compared to the massacre I was looking at now. I clicked on the master folder labeled Pending Acquisitions and Liquidations. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if it was reluctant to show me the sheer scale of the destruction. When the page finally loaded, my eyes immediately locked onto 2 specific addresses listed at the very top of the screen. They were highlighted in aggressive yellow, indicating priority fast-track processing. I felt the breath leave my lungs. These were not random strip malls or outdated office parks. These were the twin South Dallas distribution centers. They were the absolute crown jewels of my entire commercial real estate portfolio. I had purchased that land 30 years ago, when the area was nothing but dust and scrub brush. I had personally overseen the pouring of every square foot of concrete. I had negotiated the long-term leases with multinational logistics companies, securing guaranteed revenue streams that had kept my company completely bulletproof through 3 separate economic recessions. They were massive state-of-the-art facilities, spanning hundreds of thousands of square feet. They were the beating heart of my empire. And my son was putting them on the chopping block. My hands actually shook as I opened the attached digital contracts. I needed to see the terms. I needed to see who was buying them and, more importantly, for how much. In a normal market, these 2 properties together would easily appraise for $25 million. In today's highly aggressive industrial real estate market, a patient seller could easily squeeze out 28 or even 30 million. But as my eyes scrolled down to the final agreed-upon purchase price, my vision blurred with a mixture of absolute rage and profound confusion. $15 million. I blinked, leaning so close to the monitor that I could see the individual pixels. 15 million. Derek was liquidating the cornerstone of our company for a mere 60% of its actual market value. It was a financial slaughter. No sane businessman, no matter how inexperienced, would ever authorize a sale that left $10 to $15 million sitting on the table. It defied every fundamental rule of commercial real estate. I pulled up the timeline of the transaction, tracing the digital signatures and the notary stamps. The speed of the deal was absolutely staggering. A commercial transaction of this magnitude usually takes months of due diligence. Environmental studies, structural inspections, and endless legal negotiations. But Derek had pushed this entirely through in just 12 days. He had waived the inspection periods. He had bypassed our standard internal legal review. He was treating the crown jewels of a 30-year-old empire like a stolen television, being pawned for quick cash in a back alley. The final closing date was set for this coming Monday. The funds were scheduled to hit our corporate escrow account in less than 48 hours. He was rushing the close at a catastrophic discount, burning down the very foundation of his own inheritance just to get his hands on $15 million as fast as humanly possible. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up the hotel room, suddenly feeling far too small. I paced the short distance between the bed and the window, looking out over the glittering lights of the city. The cold logic of the situation began to piece itself together in my mind. Why would an ambitious, greedy young man willingly destroy his own future wealth? The answer was terrifyingly simple. He was not planning for the future anymore. He was desperately trying to survive the present. You do not accept a 60% discount on prime real estate unless your back is pressed so hard against the wall that your ribs are breaking. Derek did not just want to take over my company to play the big boss. He was in immediate life-threatening financial peril. He had dug a hole so deep and so dark that the only way out was to detonate my life's work and use the blast to escape. He needed an 8-figure sum of cash by Monday morning, and he was willing to commit elder abuse, forge medical documents, and commit fraud to get it. I stopped pacing and pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window. The betrayal cut deeper now. It was not just about the money. It was about the absolute lack of respect for the legacy I had built for him. He was treating my blood, sweat, and tears as nothing more than a disposable resource to cover his own catastrophic failures. He thought I was safely tucked away in a sterile nursing home, heavily medicated, and completely oblivious to the fact that he was selling my soul to the lowest bidder. He thought he had outsmarted the old man, but he had left a digital trail a mile wide, and he had fundamentally underestimated my will to fight. I walked back over to the desk and stared at the glowing screen. The $15 million transaction was sitting there, pending, waiting for Monday morning. I could have frozen the escrow account right then and there. I could have called the bank and stopped the wire, but that would only stop the symptom. It would not cure the disease. I needed to know exactly who was buying these warehouses, and I needed to know exactly what Derek owed $15 million for. I could not do this alone. I needed someone on the outside, someone who knew the legal landscape as well as I knew the real estate market. I needed a predator. I reached into my travel bag, bypassed my main cell phone, and pulled out a cheap, prepaid burner phone I always kept for emergencies. It was time to call in the wolf and finally expose every single lie my son had carefully crafted to destroy my entire life before Monday morning came crashing down upon us both. I pressed the small plastic buttons on the burner phone, dialing a number I had committed to memory over 40 years ago. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Victor Bradley did not believe in pleasantries. He was a 70-year-old corporate attorney who had navigated the bloodiest mergers and acquisitions in Texas history. We had met in our late 20s, two hungry men trying to carve out our own pieces of the world. He was the only man I trusted implicitly with my life, my money, and my secrets. I simply told him that Derek had locked me out of the house, forged a medical power of attorney, and was actively liquidating the South Dallas distribution centers at a 60% discount. The line went completely silent for 5 long seconds. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background. Then Victor asked me exactly where I was. I gave him the address of the downtown hotel and my room number. He told me to put on a pot of coffee and hung up. Less than 45 minutes later, a sharp knock echoed through my hotel room. I opened the door to find Victor in the hallway. He wore a charcoal suit holding a massive leather briefcase. Despite his silver hair, he possessed the intimidating presence of a silverback gorilla. He stepped inside, his sharp eyes sweeping over the sterile decor and the laptop glowing on the small desk. He offered no pity. He did not ask how I was feeling after my stroke or how my heart was handling the betrayal. Victor knew sympathy was useless in war. Instead, he dropped his briefcase onto the mattress, popped the brass latches, and began pulling out thick legal pads, secure encrypted drives, and a portable scanner. We moved the hotel desk to the center of the room, creating a makeshift command center. I ordered black coffee and we went to work. The contrast between my reality and the narrative my son had constructed was laughable. Derek and his wife Megan were likely entertaining guests back at my estate, basking in the warm evening, completely convinced that I was sitting in a depressing assisted living facility under heavy sedatives. They believed the old man was out of the game for good. They had no idea their actions had just awakened two of the most ruthless veterans in the Dallas commercial real estate sector. We were not resting. We were loading our weapons meticulously, preparing to completely dismantle the arrogant illusion of power he had built. Victor pulled up a chair, plugged his secure drive into my laptop, and piggybacked off the ghost protocol. As a former federal prosecutor, Victor possessed a terrifying ability to read between the lines of financial documents. He did not just look at the numbers, he looked at the intent behind them. While I had focused on the pending warehouse sale, Victor began a rapid forensic audit of Derek's digital existence over the past year. He pulled up personal expense reports, cross-referenced them with corporate credit lines, and started mapping the exact trajectory of my son's desperation. The hotel room grew warm and thick with the smell of roasted coffee and the quiet, intense hum of the laptop fan. We worked in total synchronization, a silent ballet of two old friends who had fought 100 battles together. I would pull up the internal routing numbers, and Victor would trace them through the external banking networks. For 3 straight hours, the only sounds in the room were the furious clacking of keyboards, the rustling of paper, and the occasional sharp exhale from Victor when he found another piece of the puzzle. He was dissecting Derek's life with surgical precision. He started with the $500,000 in missing operating cash. Within 20 minutes, Victor had completely dismantled the fake consulting invoices Derek had uploaded. By running the routing numbers through his proprietary legal database, Victor discovered that the shell companies receiving the funds were not consulting firms at all. They were offshore holding accounts registered in the Cayman Islands accounts, notorious for their complete lack of transparency and their frequent use in hiding illicit funds from domestic authorities. Derek was not just stealing. He was systematically laundering corporate money across international borders. But Victor did not stop there. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, his eyes locked onto the screen. He noted that moving $500,000 offshore was a significant federal crime, but it did not explain the sheer panic of selling the South Dallas warehouses for $15 million by Monday morning. The offshore transfers were a clumsy attempt to hide cash, but the real estate liquidation was a desperate attempt to generate massive immediate capital. Victor pulled up the pending purchase agreement for the warehouses. He bypassed the financial terms and scrolled directly to the buyer's information. The purchasing entity was listed as a limited liability company based out of Delaware, a state famous for allowing corporate owners to remain entirely anonymous from the general public. Most people would have hit a frustrating dead end right there. But Victor Bradley was certainly not like most ordinary people. He opened a hidden backdoor legal registry he used for corporate espionage, bypassing public records, and digging straight into the registered agent filings. I watched his face as data populated on the screen. The grim expression he had worn for the last 3 hours suddenly vanished, replaced by a look of unadulterated shock. He slowly turned to look at me, taking off his reading glasses. He whispered my name, his voice tight with an emotion I had never heard from him before. He told me I needed to look at the screen. He had finally found the registered agent for the shell company. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together, revealing a picture so grotesque and twisted that it took the breath right out of my lungs. I leaned over the makeshift desk, my eyes tracing the lines of data Victor had highlighted on his encrypted screen. The room was deathly quiet save for the low hum of the laptop and the distant wail of a police siren down in the Dallas streets. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I read the name listed under the registered agent for the Delaware Limited Liability Company. It was not a faceless corporate conglomerate. It was not a rival real estate developer swooping in for a predatory bargain. The name staring back at me in stark white letters was Tyler Evans. I blinked, feeling a sudden chill wash over my skin. Tyler Evans was not a titan of industry. He was a 28-year-old failed graphic designer who spent most of his time asking his sister for loans to fund his various doomed startup ideas. His sister was Megan, my daughter-in-law, the same woman who had stood on my front porch just a few hours ago wearing her pristine tennis outfit and a mask of fake concern, telling me I needed to be locked away in an assisted living facility. Victor let out a low, humorless laugh that sounded like gravel grinding against stone. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his broad chest. He explained the entire scheme with the cold, clinical detachment of a seasoned prosecutor dissecting a murder scene. They were not selling the South Dallas distribution centers to a third party to generate cash. They were selling the crown jewels of my empire directly to themselves. It was a textbook shell game designed to completely strip the massive assets from the corporate portfolio and place them safely behind an anonymous corporate veil controlled entirely by Megan and her family. I stared at the screen, my mind racing, to process the sheer audacity of the fraud. Victor walked me through the mechanics of the transaction. They had set up the Delaware Shell Company exactly 3 weeks ago, right around the time I first started complaining about chest pains. The timing was absolutely not a coincidence. It was a calculated and deeply malicious contingency plan. By setting the purchase price at a heavily discounted $15 million, they were manufacturing a catastrophic financial loss for my company. But the true evil genius of their twisted plan lay entirely in the mechanics of the fraudulent financing. Victor pulled up another hidden document, a loan origination file attached to Tyler's shell company. They had secured a $15 million private equity loan to fund the purchase, using the warehouses themselves as the primary collateral. They were essentially using my own buildings to guarantee the money they were using to buy them from me. Once the transaction closed on Monday morning, the $15 million would be wired directly into our corporate escrow account. Under the forged power of attorney Derek, would immediately have full, unrestricted, and unchallenged access to every single penny of those funds. Victor pointed at the screen with a thick, calloused finger. He laid out the ultimate endgame. Derek and Megan would wire that $15 million out of the corporate account and straight into their untraceable offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. They would vanish with the liquid cash, leaving my company gutted, empty, and bleeding. Meanwhile, Megan's brother would be sitting on $25 million worth of prime commercial real estate in South Dallas. Even with the $15 million loan attached to it, they had instantly created $10 million of pure laundered equity for themselves out of thin air. It was an absolute masterpiece of corporate theft. The profound reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was not a panicked, desperate move made by a son who had simply gotten in over his head. This was a highly sophisticated, deeply premeditated criminal conspiracy. Derek and Megan had sat at my dining room table for Sunday dinners, smiling, and asking me to pass the wine while secretly constructing an elaborate financial guillotine designed specifically to sever my head from my life's work. Megan had actively brought her own brother into the fold, turning the absolute destruction of my legacy into a twisted, cooperative family business. I thought about the countless times I had helped Megan and Derek. I remembered paying off Megan's massive credit card debts when they first got married without ever saying a single word. I remembered hiring the best contractors in the state to build their custom home, the very same home they were currently celebrating my demise in. I had treated her like my own flesh and blood, and in return, she had orchestrated a hostile takeover of my entire existence using her own sibling as the proxy executioner. The profound sorrow that had been weighing me down began to evaporate completely, replaced by a cold, crystallized fury. The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly corrupt, that it completely severed whatever lingering emotional ties I had left for the boy I had raised. Derek was no longer my son. He was a hostile threat. Megan was not family. She was a parasite. And I was about to show both of them exactly why I was the one who built the empire they were so desperately trying to steal. I turned back to Victor. The attorney was watching me with a silent, profound understanding. He knew the unbearable weight of what I was processing. I asked him the only question that still mattered. I asked if we had enough hard evidence to stop the transfer before Monday morning. Victor shook his head slowly. He explained that stopping the wire would only trigger a protracted legal war. Derek still held the forged power of attorney. If we blocked the sale now, he would panic and flee. We had to let the trap snap shut completely. We absolutely must let them win today. We absolutely must let them win today. I stared at Victor, trying to comprehend the sheer gravity of his words. Letting them win meant allowing $15 million of my hard-earned work to slide directly into the hands of my treacherous son and his manipulative wife. It went against every single instinct I had developed over 40 years in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate. When you see a thief with his hand in your pocket, you break his fingers. You do not wait for him to pull the wallet out. But Victor raised a hand, urging me to remain calm. He explained that if we moved too soon, if we simply blocked the escrow transfer and confronted Derek with the shell company documents, we would only have evidence of an attempted corporate manipulation. Derek could claim it was a legitimate, albeit aggressive, restructuring strategy. He could hire expensive lawyers, tie the company up in endless litigation, and drag my name through the mud while I fought a grueling battle in civil court. Victor leaned closer, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. He told me that to put Derek away permanently, to ensure he faced federal prison instead of a civil lawsuit, the wire transfer had to initiate. The crime of federal wire fraud is only fully committed when the money actually moves across state lines under false pretenses. But that still left the most crucial question completely unanswered. Why was Derek doing this right now? Why rush a massive real estate liquidation at a 60% discount, risking exposure and absolute ruin just to launder $15 million? He already had a multi-million-dollar trust fund. He had a 6-figure salary. He lived in a house I paid for. The pieces of the puzzle were on the table, but the central picture was still obscured by shadows. Victor turned back to his encrypted laptop, his fingers flying across the keys with a renewed intensity. He said that a man only burns down his own castle if he is trying to stop something much worse from breaching the walls. He began to trace the digital breadcrumbs backward from the offshore Cayman accounts, looking for the initial spark that ignited this desperate inferno. It took him almost 2 hours of digging through hidden servers and bypassing secondary firewalls to find the source of the rot. When he finally pulled up the hidden ledger, the silence in the room became incredibly heavy. Victor turned the laptop screen toward me, his face devoid of any expression. It was a digital statement from an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. I am an old-school real estate developer. I understand bricks, concrete, steel, and long-term leases. I never trusted digital currency, and I had strictly forbidden my company from engaging in any speculative crypto investments. But my son, always convinced he was the smartest man in the room, had completely ignored my mandates. Victor pointed to a series of massive transactions executed 3 months ago. Derek had not just bought cryptocurrency. He had engaged in something called high-risk margin trading. He had borrowed an astronomical amount of money to place a massive leveraged bet on a highly volatile digital asset, hoping to double his net worth overnight. But to secure that kind of loan from an unregulated shadow syndicate, he needed collateral. My blood ran cold as I looked at the collateral documents attached to the digital loan. Derek had secretly pledged the corporate assets of Harrison Commercial Real Estate and Logistics as the absolute backing for his personal gambling addiction. He had forged my signature to guarantee the debt. Then the market crashed. The digital asset plummeted in value, triggering an immediate and catastrophic margin call. Derek was completely liquidated. The screen showed the final devastating balance. My son owed $12 million to a shadow syndicate of unregulated offshore lenders. These were not traditional bankers who would politely renegotiate a payment plan over a round of golf. These were dangerous, faceless entities who specialized in aggressively recovering their debts through any means necessary. Suddenly, the entire elaborate scheme made perfect, horrifying sense. The panic, the sudden rush to declare me mentally incompetent, the fire sale of the South Dallas warehouses to his brother-in-law. They did not kick me out of my own home to take over the company and run my legacy. They kicked me out because the wolves were already at the door. Derek needed $15 million by Monday morning to pay off the $12 million debt and use the remaining $3 million to vanish. He and Megan were planning to flee the country, escaping to a non-extradition jurisdiction where they could live comfortably on the remaining stolen cash. But the true evil of their plan was the wreckage they intended to leave behind. By using my company to secure the debt and executing the fraudulent sale under my name with that forged power of attorney, they were legally positioning me to take the absolute fall. When the dust settled and the federal investigators came knocking, they would find a gutted corporation, massive fraudulent transfers, and my forged signature on every single document. Derek was planning to leave his own father to face the federal government, the furious creditors, and the absolute destruction of our family name while he drank cocktails on a private beach. He was going to let me die in a federal prison hospital just so he could escape the consequences of his own monumental stupidity. I stood up from the desk, my legs feeling like lead. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city I had helped build. The pain in my chest was sharp and undeniable, but it was no longer the pain of a broken heart. It was the absolute focused clarity of a man who realized he was fighting for his life. I turned back to Victor and nodded my head. I turned back to Victor and nodded my head. The silence stretched for a long moment, heavy with the weight of our discovery. Victor closed his encrypted laptop with a sharp, decisive snap. He looked at me, his jaw set in a hard line. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He told me he was calling his best contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. We had enough circumstantial evidence combined with the forged medical documents and the offshore shell company records to get an emergency injunction to halt the Monday morning transaction. He insisted we freeze the assets immediately and let federal prosecutors sort out the mess before my son could trigger the massive debt collapse on my company. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his. I looked into the eyes of the man who had fought beside me in boardrooms for 40 years, and I shook my head slowly. No, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a tone of absolute finality. Do not make the call. Not yet. Victor frowned, his hand hovering over the keypad of his phone. He argued that we were playing a dangerous game. He reminded me that $15 million was scheduled to hit our corporate escrow account the moment the bank opened on Monday. He warned me that if Derek managed to authorize the outbound wire transfer to the Cayman Islands before we could intercept it, the money would be gone forever. It would vanish into a digital black hole, completely untouchable by American law enforcement, and I would be left holding the bag. I stood my ground, my grip on his hand tightening. I understood the risks perfectly, but I also understood the law, and more importantly, I understood the fundamental cowardice of my son. I explained to Victor that if we called the authorities tonight, we were only stopping an attempted transaction. Derek was smart enough to muddy the waters. He could claim the warehouse sale was a legitimate business strategy to raise capital during a perceived corporate crisis. He could argue that the power of attorney was executed because he genuinely believed my health was failing. A clever defense attorney could easily spin this into a complex civil dispute between a father and a son over the direction of a family business. At best, Derek would get a slap on the wrist. At worst, he would drag my name through a decade of exhausting public litigation. I walked over to the makeshift desk and looked at the black screen of the laptop. I told Victor that I did not want a civil dispute. I did not want a messy family court battle. I wanted absolute, undeniable justice. And to get that, we needed to let Derek and Megan cross the point of no return. I laid out the mechanics of the trap. The $15 million would hit the corporate escrow account on Monday morning. That money technically belonged to the company, but the true crime, the undeniable ironclad federal offense, would only occur when Derek physically signed the final wire transfer authorization to move those funds from our domestic corporate account to his hidden offshore holding company. The moment he signed that document and initiated the transfer under false pretenses using the forged power of attorney, he would be committing textbook federal wire fraud. There would be no gray area. There would be no civil defense. It would be a premeditated criminal act carrying a mandatory federal prison sentence. I wanted his signature in ink. I wanted his digital fingerprint on the transfer protocol. I wanted the fraud to be so blatantly executed that no high-priced defense attorney in the country could possibly save him. I was willing to risk $15 million to ensure that the man who tried to destroy my life would be locked in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. Victor stared at me, the harsh hotel lighting casting deep shadows across his weathered face. He was a ruthless man, but even he was taken aback by the sheer coldness of my strategy. He slowly lowered his phone and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I was willing to take this gamble. He reminded me that we were operating on a razor-thin margin of error. If the banking system processed Derek's outbound wire before we could enact our countermeasures, the empire I had built from the dirt up would be completely wiped out. I walked back to the window, looking out at the glittering lights of the Dallas skyline. I had spent my life building those lights. I was not about to let a parasite extinguish them. I told Victor that I was certain. I had survived poverty, economic crashes, and a stroke. I was not going to let a spoiled child and his manipulative wife beat me at my own game. We were going to sit in this hotel room, drink terrible black coffee, and watch the digital clock tick down to Monday morning. We were going to let Derek believe he had won. We were going to let him taste the victory, let him pack his bags, and let him walk right up to the finish line. And then, at the very last possible second, we were going to drop the floor out from under him. Victor let out a long, heavy sigh, a grim smile finally breaking across his face. He sat back down at the desk, opened his laptop, and told me we had a lot of work to do to prepare the kill switch. I stood silently over his shoulder, watching the lines of code begin to fill the screen once again. We had 48 hours until the banks opened. 48 hours until my son would unknowingly seal his own fate. The trap was ready, and I was holding the lock. Victor leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes, and finally asked the question hovering between us. He asked how I planned to stop a digital transaction that processes in milliseconds. A forged power of attorney, as far as the bank's automated computers were concerned, was a perfectly valid golden ticket. Victor argued that human intervention would be far too slow to intercept a wire of that magnitude. He said we needed an immovable roadblock. I smiled a cold smile that felt foreign on my face. I told him the roadblock was already there, built directly into the bedrock of the company itself. I asked Victor if he remembered the corporate restructuring we executed exactly a decade ago. He frowned, his memory sifting through thousands of past legal battles. I reminded him of the year my wife passed away, the year I suddenly realized my mortality, and began to look closely at the men Derek was choosing to associate with. I had seen too many wealthy families tear themselves apart, watching greedy heirs liquidate carefully built empires the moment the patriarch closed his eyes. I decided then that I would never allow my legacy to be dismantled by an incompetent successor. So I instructed our outside legal counsel in Washington to bury a highly classified contingency clause deep within the company's master operating agreement. I called it the poison pill. Victor looked intrigued, his mind grasping the concept. A poison pill is a corporate finance strategy used to discourage hostile takeovers by making the company's stock unattractive to the acquirer. But I had adapted the concept for a personal threat. I explained the precise mechanics of the clause to Victor. I had hardwired a rigid financial covenant directly into our primary federal banking charter. The rule was absolute and carried zero exceptions. If any executive board member or individual holding a power of attorney attempted to liquidate corporate assets that exceeded 30% of the company's total net worth within a single fiscal quarter, the system required a highly specific secondary authorization. A simple signature, whether forged or authentic, was completely insufficient. A standard notary stamp was useless. The bank's master protocol demanded my physical biometric verification. It required my live fingerprint scanned and verified in person at the regional federal bank headquarters, alongside a specialized notarized affidavit confirming my uncoerced consent. Derek had absolutely no idea this clause even existed. He was operating under the arrogant assumption that his forged medical document gave him the keys to the kingdom. He thought the power of attorney was an invincible shield, but he had never bothered to read the foundational bylaws of the empire he was so eager to inherit. Victor's eyes widened as the sheer brilliance of the trap dawned on him. He realized that the sale of the South Dallas distribution centers priced at $15 million perfectly crossed the 30% threshold of our current liquid valuation. Derek was stepping right onto the trigger plate of a massive financial landmine. I walked Victor through exactly what would happen on Monday morning. Derek would log into the executive banking portal. He would confidently upload the signed purchase agreement from his brother-in-law. He would attach his fraudulent power of attorney. He would initiate the $15 million wire transfer to the offshore Cayman account, fully believing he was seconds away from a life of luxurious freedom. The bank's automated system would receive the request and immediately scan the master operating agreement for compliance. It would instantly detect the massive asset liquidation. It would look for my biometric verification. When it failed to find my fingerprint, the system would not just decline the transaction. It would automatically trigger a catastrophic loan call. A loan call is the equivalent of a financial detonation. The federal bank, sensing a massive unauthorized hemorrhage of collateral assets, would immediately declare the company to be in a state of critical default. Every single line of credit, every corporate mortgage, and every operational account tied to the Harrison name would be instantly and permanently frozen. The $15 million would be locked in a federal holding vault, completely untouchable by anyone. But the devastating consequences did not stop there. The automated security protocols would instantly generate a high-priority suspicious activity report, flagging the entire transaction as a potential massive fraud and money laundering attempt. The system would automatically dispatch these reports directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Derek would not just fail to get his money. He would accidentally lock himself inside a financial vault and automatically hit the silent alarm, summoning every federal agency in the country directly to his doorstep. Victor let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. He called it a masterpiece of corporate warfare. He realized that by letting Derek initiate the wire transfer, we were forcing him to hand-deliver the absolute proof of his own federal crimes directly to the authorities. We did not need to hire private investigators or fight a messy civil battle. We simply had to sit back and let the automated banking system execute my son for his treason. The beauty of the poison pill was its emotionless efficiency. It could not be reasoned with, bribed, or manipulated. I looked down at the encrypted laptop, the screen illuminating the dark hotel room. We had built the perfect cage, and the rat was eagerly running right toward the cheese. I told Victor to close the laptop and get some sleep. The heavy lifting was officially over. There was absolutely nothing left for us to do but wait. The next 48 hours would be a brutal test of patience, a silent countdown to the absolute destruction of the boy I had once loved. I sat in the chair, staring out the window into the deep Texas night, feeling the cold anticipation settling into my bones. Sunday evening arrived with a heavy, suffocating slowness. The weekend had been a grueling exercise in absolute psychological endurance. I sat in the same stiff hotel chair, bathed in the dim, artificial glow of my encrypted laptop screen. Outside my window, the relentless Dallas sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Victor had left a few hours earlier to return to his own home and get some necessary rest, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet corporate suite. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Every second that ticked by was 1 second closer to the opening of the federal banking system. Every minute was a step closer to the total annihilation of my own flesh and blood. I did not eat. I barely drank the tepid water sitting on the desk. My mind was entirely consumed by the chilling reality of what was about to unfold. Across town, shielded by the heavy oak doors and wrought iron gates of my custom-built estate, a very different kind of evening was taking place. I did not need hidden cameras to know exactly what Derek and Megan were doing. I knew my son. I knew his arrogance. I could picture the scene with crystal clarity. They were celebrating. The grand foyer of my home, a space I had designed to welcome family and friends, was likely littered with expensive, oversized designer luggage. Megan was probably moving between our spacious master bedroom and the hallway, meticulously packing her silk vacation clothes, designer sunglasses, and expensive jewelry. They were preparing for their grand escape to the Cayman Islands. I could almost hear the sharp, celebratory clink of my best crystal glasses echoing off the hardwood floors. They were undoubtedly drinking the vintage champagne I had been saving in the cellar for a special occasion. To them, this was the ultimate special occasion. They had successfully conquered the old man. In their minds, they had executed the absolute perfect crime. Derek was likely strutting around my home office, sitting in my heavy leather chair, behind my mahogany desk, feeling like a titan of industry. He probably looked over the forged medical power of attorney one last time, admiring his own deceitful handiwork. He genuinely believed that the falsified dementia diagnosis was an impenetrable shield of armor. He thought he had outsmarted a man who had survived 4 decades of cutthroat commercial real estate wars. He and Megan were bathing in their false victory, laughing at how easily they had discarded me onto the street, completely oblivious to the fact that they were dancing on a floor rigged with high explosives. Their sheer, unadulterated confidence was the exact weapon I was using against them. Back in the cold hotel room, the physical and emotional toll of the last few days began to settle deep into my bones. My chest ached with a dull, persistent throb. It was not the physical strain of my recent stroke, but the agonizing emotional severing of the bond between a father and his child. I was mourning a ghost. The little boy who used to run down the driveway to greet me when I came home from work was entirely dead and gone. He had been entirely consumed by the greedy, desperate stranger currently packing bags in my house. I realized then that the hardest part of betrayal is not the financial loss. It is the terrifying realization that the person you would take a bullet for is the exact same person holding the smoking gun. I closed my eyes and let the final wave of grief wash over me. I allowed myself one last moment of profound sorrow for the family I thought I had. When I opened my eyes again, the grief was completely gone, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve of steel. The stakes of the impending morning were absolutely monumental. The $15 million wire transfer was sitting in the digital queue, waiting for the bank doors to open. Once Derek logged in and authorized that transaction to his offshore shell company, the poison pill would automatically activate. There would be no warning klaxons. There would be no confirmation prompts. The federal banking system would simply snap the trap shut. The loan call would instantly freeze every single asset tied to his name, my name, and the entire corporate entity. The automated suspicious activity reports would be instantly dispatched to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Once the sun came up, the gears, the forces of the federal justice system would begin to turn, and absolutely nothing on earth could stop them. I was holding the launch keys to a financial nuclear weapon, and my son was begging me to turn them. I glanced down at my cell phone resting on the edge of the desk. The screen was black and silent. Derek had not called to check on me. He had not sent a single message to see if his supposedly sick, mentally declining father had safely arrived at the nursing home. He did not care if I was lost, scared, or dying. His absolute silence was the final confirmation I needed. He was completely comfortable with my destruction so long as it secured his salvation. He thought he was the ultimate apex predator in this scenario. He believed he was the wolf who had successfully culled the weak from the herd. But he was severely mistaken. He was nothing but blind prey, wandering happily into a steel-jawed trap, entirely mesmerized by the bait. The digital clock on the bottom corner of my laptop screen shifted from 11:59 to midnight. Sunday was officially over. Monday morning had arrived in the dark. The city below my window grew incredibly still, as if holding its breath in anticipation of the carnage to come. I sat forward in my chair, resting my hands on the edge of the desk. The wait was almost over. In just a few short hours, the sun would rise, the banks would open their digital vaults, and Derek would make his final fatal move. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, knowing that his arrogance would compel him to make one last gesture of cruelty before he tried to vanish forever. I waited in the absolute silence of the room, completely prepared for the storm. The hours dragged on with a punishing wait, each tick of the wall clock echoing like a hammer strike in the barren hotel room. I remained entirely motionless in the stiff chair, watching the shadows stretch and warp across the gray carpet as the streetlights flickered outside. My mind was completely empty of hesitation. I had shed the last remnants of my parental mercy. I was no longer a father hoping to discipline a wayward child. I was a sovereign defending the borders of my life's work against a hostile invader. The air conditioning unit hummed a low, steady drone, a monotonous soundtrack to the final moments of my former life. I knew Derek well enough to anticipate his final move. Men driven by profound insecurity always need to have the last word. They cannot simply take their prize and slip away into the shadows. They must gloat. They must ensure their victim feels the full sting of their perceived superiority. I kept my eyes locked on the dark rectangle of my cell phone, knowing that his inflated ego would eventually force him to reach out. He needed to twist the knife one last time to satisfy his own fragile pride. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, the pitch-black room was suddenly pierced by the sharp, blinding glare of my phone screen. The device vibrated violently against the cheap veneer of the nightstand, shattering the suffocating silence. I did not flinch. I did not rush to pick it up. I simply turned my head and stared at the glowing notification banner. The name Derek Harrison illuminated the darkness, a name that now felt entirely alien to me. I reached out with a steady hand, my fingers cool and precise, and unlocked the screen. There it was, the exact message that would forever sever the bloodline between us. You are no longer part of this family. We will move on without you. Do not come back. The words were perfectly aligned on the glowing display, carrying the cold, sterile cruelty of a corporate termination notice. I read the message 3 times, letting the profound malice of his statement wash over me. He had sent it from the comfort of my own home, likely standing in my living room, completely convinced that he had won the ultimate victory. He wanted me to spend the rest of my supposedly brief dementia-ridden life knowing that my own son had intentionally erased me from existence. He wanted me to feel the crushing weight of absolute abandonment. But as I stared at those harsh words, I did not feel abandoned. I felt entirely liberated. His text message was the final, undeniable proof that I owed him absolutely nothing. He had voluntarily abdicated his position as my son, releasing me from any lingering moral obligation to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. The guilt that had been threatening to crack my resolve completely vanished, replaced by a pure, unadulterated focus. I tapped the reply field on the screen. The digital keyboard popped up, waiting for my response. A weaker man might have typed a furious paragraph, demanding answers, pleading for mercy, or threatening legal retaliation. But I knew that any display of emotion would only feed his massive ego. It would validate his illusion of control. I did not want to argue with a dead man walking. I only needed to let him know that his terms were accepted. I slowly typed a single 4-letter word. Okay. I stared at the word for a brief moment, appreciating its absolute simplicity. It was not a surrender. It was a receipt. It was the calm acknowledgement of a general watching his enemy march willingly into a minefield. I pressed send. The tiny message bubbled up on the screen, a quiet and permanent end to 42 years of fatherhood. I placed the phone face down on the desk, cutting off the harsh glare, and turned my full attention back to the heavy military-grade laptop. The Ghost protocol was still actively running on the screen, the complex lines of code waiting patiently for my final command. The timeline had officially caught up to the present moment. The circle was now completely closed. I was back where this entire nightmare had begun, but the context had shifted entirely. I was no longer a victim reacting to a sudden ambush. I was the architect of the counterattack. I rested my fingers on the keyboard, taking one final deep breath to steady the adrenaline rushing through my veins. The trap was already built into the master operating agreement, but I needed to actively arm the poison pill to ensure there were absolutely no digital loopholes for Derek to exploit when the banks opened. I opened the master security console within the hidden executive portal. I navigated through 3 layers of biometric verification, confirming my identity with my fingerprint and my retinal scan. The system granted me absolute administrative oversight. I located the specific financial covenant governing the South Dallas distribution centers. I executed a manual override command, locking the digital trigger firmly into place. I typed the final authorization code, a sequence of numbers only I possessed, and firmly pressed the Enter key. The laptop screen flashed a brilliant solid green for a fraction of a second before returning to the standard dashboard display. A small, sterile notification box appeared in the center of the monitor. Override command confirmed. Security protocols armed. The point of no return had officially been crossed. The trap was sprung. The digital jaws of the federal banking system were now locked open, waiting for Derek to take his final fatal step. I slowly leaned back in my stiff chair, quietly listening to the steady hum of the laptop fan. There was no going back now. The board was set, the pieces were locked, and the absolute destruction of the son I had raised was now entirely inevitable and thoroughly deserved. The first light of Monday morning began to bleed through the edges of the hotel curtains painting the hotel walls. I had not slept a single moment yet. I felt an unnatural surge of energy coursing through my veins. The small digital clock of my encrypted laptop read exactly 8 in the morning. On the East Coast, the financial markets were already awake, and the central servers of the federal banking system were humming to life. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed entirely on the master dashboard of my corporate network. The silence in the room was absolute, but in the digital world, a monumental storm was brewing. I knew Derek's travel itinerary. Derek and Megan were scheduled to board a first-class flight to the Cayman Islands at 11 o'clock this morning. To make that flight, Derek needed the $15 million to clear the escrow account and bounce to his offshore holding company. He would not wait. His anxiety and the crushing weight of his $12 million debt to the Shadow Syndicate would absolutely compel him to execute the transfer at the first available moment. He probably had the banking app open on his phone in the back of a luxury town car, heading toward the airport, his thumb hovering over the screen. At exactly 8:05, the screen of my laptop flickered. A small, pulsing yellow icon appeared in the top right corner of the transaction log. A pending outbound wire transfer had just been initiated. The amount requested was exactly $15 million. The destination was the offshore shell company Victor had uncovered. The authorizing signature attached to the digital request belonged to Derek Harrison, utilizing the power of attorney he had forged while I lay in a hospital bed. I leaned forward, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. He had actually done it. He had taken the bait completely blind to the steel jaws waiting in the shadows. For a few agonizing milliseconds, the transaction status remained yellow. The bank's massive server farms were processing the request, reading the routing numbers, verifying the available balance, and authenticating the power of attorney. In a normal scenario, the yellow icon would simply turn green, the money would instantly vanish into the ether, and the empire I had spent 40 years building would be dealt a fatal, unrecoverable blow. But this was not a normal scenario. I held my breath watching the tiny yellow circle pulse on the dark screen. Suddenly, the yellow icon vanished, replaced by a glaring red warning triangle. The system had hit the roadblock. The automated intelligence of the federal banking network had scanned the transaction and immediately recognized that a $15 million liquidation vastly exceeded the 30% threshold of the company's net worth. The poison pill protocol engaged with ruthless, emotionless efficiency. The system instantly searched for the mandatory secondary authorization. It scanned for my physical biometric fingerprint and the specialized notarized affidavit confirming my uncoerced consent. When it found absolutely nothing, the banking core did not merely decline the transfer. It reacted exactly as it had been programmed to react to a massive hostile financial breach. The screen on my laptop erupted in a cascade of automated alerts. The status of the $15 million instantly changed from pending to frozen. A secondary alert popped up indicating that the loan call contingency had been successfully triggered. In the blink of an eye, the bank automatically suspended every single operational account, every corporate credit card, and every line of credit associated with Harrison Commercial Real Estate. The massive vault doors of my empire slammed shut and locked from the inside, trapping Derek's stolen funds in an impenetrable federal holding cell. But the digital guillotine was not finished falling. By attempting to move such a massive sum of money offshore under a flagged protocol, Derek had tripped the highest-level security wire in the American banking system. My screen displayed a rapid sequence of confirmation receipts as the bank's automated compliance software generated multiple suspicious activity reports. These were not internal memos. These were high-priority, legally mandated alerts triggered by suspected severe financial crimes. I watched in grim fascination as the system automatically compiled the data. It packaged the forged power of attorney, the details of the offshore Cayman account, the connection to the Delaware shell company, managed by Megan's brother, and the $15 million wire request. Within seconds, these comprehensive dossiers were dispatched directly to the secure servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Treasury Department. Derek thought he was quietly stealing his inheritance. Instead, he had just broadcasted a meticulously documented confession of federal wire fraud and international money laundering directly to the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country. The federal trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. I slowly let out the breath I had been holding. The red warning alerts remained frozen on my screen, a beautiful and terrifying testament to the absolute power of preparation. The money was safe. The company, though temporarily frozen, was completely shielded from his destructive greed. I closed the laptop and ran a hand over my tired face. I felt no joy in this victory. There is no triumph in watching your own son destroy his life, even when he entirely deserves it. The silent hotel room felt colder than before. The digital execution had occurred flawlessly, but the human fallout was just beginning to materialize. Right now, Derek was likely sitting in a VIP lounge at the airport, staring at a declined transaction message on his phone, completely unable to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had just swallowed him whole. He had $12 million in debt to violent creditors, his escape funds were locked in federal custody, and the FBI was currently reading his file. The clock on the wall ticked forward. It was time for the final confrontation. The clock on the wall ticked forward. It was time for the final confrontation. The sun had fully risen over Dallas, casting a bright glare across the massive glass terminals of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Inside the sprawling complex, the atmosphere was a mix of organized chaos and high-end luxury. Derek and Megan walked confidently through the automatic sliding doors of Terminal D, looking every bit the picture of young inherited wealth. Megan was dressed in her designer resort wear, trailing matching leather luggage, while Derek wore a tailored suit, his posture exuding the arrogant entitlement of a man who believed he had conquered the world. They bypassed the winding lines of economy travelers and made their way straight to the exclusive first-class check-in desk. Derek practically tossed his passports and the heavy corporate platinum card onto the polished granite counter, casually asking the agent to process the final upgrade fees and international departure taxes for their flight to the Cayman Islands. The ticketing agent swiped the heavy metal card through the terminal. The machine beeped a sharp negative tone. She frowned, slightly apologized, and swiped it again. Another sharp beep. She looked up at Derek, her smile faltering. "I am sorry, sir, but this card is declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes in obvious annoyance. He told her it was simply a security glitch because of the international destination. He reached into his designer wallet and pulled out his personal black card, a line of credit heavily tied to the corporate accounts. He handed it over with a dismissive wave. The agent swiped the second card. The machine beeped again, displaying the exact same error code. Megan shifted uncomfortably, looking around to see if anyone in the VIP lane was watching them. Derek's confident smirk finally began to crack. He snatched the cards back from the counter, his face flushing with sudden embarrassment. He told the agent to hold their bags while he called his private wealth manager to sort out the computer error. Derek stepped away from the counter, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen of his smartphone. He opened the encrypted banking application he had used just an hour prior to initiate the $15 million wire transfer. He typed in his passwords, expecting to see a zero balance and a pending successful wire notification. Instead, the screen flashed a bright red error message. Access denied. Account suspended by order of primary account holder. Derek stopped breathing. The bustling noise of the airport terminal vanished completely, replaced by a loud ringing silence in his ears. He refreshed the application. Access denied. He tried to log into his personal checking account. Access denied. He tried his savings. Access denied. A cold, suffocating wave of pure terror washed over him. The $15 million was not in the offshore account. It was completely frozen. The only person on Earth with the biometric authority to trigger that kind of systemic lockdown was the man he had left for dead. I sat in the quiet hotel room staring at my own phone as the screen suddenly lit up. The caller identification displayed Derek's name. I did not answer. I simply let it ring until it went to voicemail. I wanted to hear the exact progression of his psychological collapse. A minute later, the first voicemail notification chimed. I pressed play, listening to the audio through the silent room. Derek's voice was tense, laced with a thin veneer of forced authority. "Dad, I am at the airport, and there is a massive glitch with the corporate accounts. The bank locked me out. I need you to call the wealth manager right now and authorize an override. Call me back immediately." He still thought he was in control. He still thought I was the confused, sick old man who could be easily manipulated with a stern tone. I let the phone sit. 5 minutes later, it rang again, then 5 more times in rapid succession. I ignored every single one. By the 10th missed call, the tone of his voicemails had shifted dramatically. The arrogant entitlement had entirely evaporated, replaced by a rising, frantic confusion. "Dad, where are you? I called the assisted living facility and they said you never checked in. What did you do to the accounts? The wire transfer did not go through. You do not understand the position you are putting me in right now. Pick up the phone." He was starting to realize that the old man was not simply confused. The old man was actively fighting back. The calls kept coming, a relentless barrage of digital desperation. 20 calls, 30 calls. I listened to his voicemails as he paced the airport terminal, his world crumbling down around him. By the 25th call, the anger had completely melted away into naked, pathetic pleading. "Dad, please. I am begging you, you have to unfreeze the accounts. Megan is crying. The ticketing agents are calling security because we cannot move our bags. You are ruining my life. Please just answer the phone. I will explain everything, I promise. Just fix the bank. But it was the 43rd voicemail that finally captured the absolute terrifying truth of his situation. His voice was no longer a demand or a plea. It was a breathless, shattered whisper of a man staring directly into his own grave. Dad. They are going to kill me. The people I owe money to, they do not care about excuses. If I do not wire that cash today, they are going to find me. And if the bank reported the wire blocked to the federal authorities, I am going to prison. I have nothing left. My cards are dead. My cash is gone. Please, I am your son. Do not let them do this to me. Save me. I listened to the final voicemail twice. He was finally telling the absolute truth. He was no longer the brilliant mastermind who had orchestrated a hostile corporate takeover. He was just a terrified boy who had played a dangerous game far beyond his comprehension and lost everything. The trap had worked flawlessly. The system had frozen him out. The federal authorities were undoubtedly moving in, and the shadow syndicate was waiting. I looked at the 43 missed calls glowing on my screen. It was time to finally answer the phone. I walked over to the small coffee maker resting on the hotel counter. I carefully placed a white porcelain cup under the spout and pressed the brew button, watching the dark liquid slowly fill the mug. The rich aroma of roasted coffee beans filled the room, bringing a comforting sense of normalcy to a Monday morning that was destined to be anything but normal. The cell phone resting on the desk began to vibrate once again. It was the 44th call. I picked up the warm mug, took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee, and walked steadily back to the makeshift command center. I picked up the phone, swiped the green icon to accept the call, and raised the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a fatherly greeting. I simply stood by the window and listened to the chaotic symphony of background noise pouring through the tiny speaker. I could hear the muffled, echoing announcements over the airport public address system, the sharp clatter of heavy luggage wheels rolling across polished tile floors, and the rapid, frantic breathing of my son. For a few agonizing seconds, Derek did not even realize the call had connected. He was cursing under his breath, muttering panicked profanities to his wife. Then the line went dead silent as he checked the screen. Dad. He screamed the words so loudly and with such intense ferocity that I had to physically pull the phone an inch away from my ear. Dad, what did you do? Unfreeze the accounts right now. You have to call the wealth manager this exact second and tell them it was a computer mistake. Tell them my medical power of attorney is perfectly valid. Tell them to push the international wire through immediately. I am not playing games with you. Unfreeze the money before you ruin everything. His voice was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant vice president who had blocked my front door just 3 days ago was entirely gone. In his place was a cornered animal snapping and snarling because he could finally feel the sharp steel teeth of the trap digging deep into his leg. He was not respectfully asking for my help. He was demanding my absolute compliance, desperately clinging to the shattered illusion that he possessed any real authority over me. I took another slow, calm sip of my coffee, letting the warm liquid coat my dry throat. I looked out the large glass window at the towering Dallas skyline, gazing at the beautiful city I had conquered through decades of honest, grueling work. I spoke softly, my voice carrying the absolute chilling calm of a man who held every single winning card in the deck. I told him I did nothing, Derek. The federal bank simply followed the foundational rules. You see, when an executive tries to quietly liquidate 30% of my entire corporate net worth without my physical biometric fingerprint, the system automatically shuts down. It is a fail-safe clause I secretly installed over 10 years ago. A poison pill. You would have known all about it if you had ever bothered to actually read the corporate bylaws instead of spending your days plotting how to steal my legacy. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. The bustling background noise of the busy airport seemed to fade away entirely, leaving only the pathetic sound of Derek taking a sharp, trembling breath. He stammered, his mind visibly struggling to process the devastating revelation. "You knew." He whispered the two words as if they physically burned his throat, the terrifying realization finally dawning on him that I was never the clueless victim he thought I was. "I knew everything," I replied, my voice slicing through his shock with surgical precision. "I knew about the forged medical documents. I knew you bribed that corrupt neurologist to declare me mentally incompetent. I knew about the ridiculous fire sale of the South Dallas distribution warehouses. And I know about the Delaware shell company registered to Megan's younger brother. You really thought you could sell my own commercial buildings to yourself and casually launder $15 million right under my nose?" Derek let out a choked, desperate sound. It was a visceral noise of pure terror. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch that echoed through the terminal. "You do not understand what is happening. I owe them money. $12 million. They margin called my crypto portfolio last week. They are going to hurt me, Dad. They are dangerous people. They know exactly where I live. They know where Megan is right now. You have to let the transfer go through today. I will pay you back every cent. I will sign the entire company over to you completely. Just give me the $15 million and let me get on this plane to the Cayman Islands." I felt a heavy coldness settle deep in my aching chest. He was still actively trying to negotiate his way out of hell. He still thought throwing money at the problem could magically fix the absolute devastation he had maliciously caused. He still foolishly believed that his old father would swoop in and save him from the violent monsters he had willingly invited into his own life. I took one final long sip of my dark coffee and set the porcelain mug down firmly on the hotel desk. I leaned closer to the phone. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart and replied with ice-cold precision. "You said I wasn't part of the family anymore. The federal bank agrees. Have a safe flight, son." I pulled the phone away from my ear, standing in the quiet room, simply listening to him screaming my name. It was a long, agonizing wail of absolute suffocating despair. I pressed the glowing red button, cutting the connection permanently and ending the nightmare for good. My thumb hovered over the glowing red button, ready to sever the connection and end the nightmare for good. But just as I was about to press it, a sudden shift in the chaotic audio pouring from the speaker caught my attention. Derek had stopped screaming my name. His agonizing wail of despair was abruptly cut short, replaced by a sharp, breathless gasp. The bustling ambient noise of the airport terminal was interrupted by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots marching across the polished tile floor. I slowly pulled the phone back toward my ear, pressing the speaker tightly against my skin. I stood still in the hotel room, holding my breath, becoming a silent witness to the exact moment my son's empire of lies completely collapsed. Through the tinny speaker, I heard a booming, authoritative voice slice through the thick chatter. The voice demanded that Derek Harrison step away from the ticketing counter and keep his hands completely visible. It was not the polite, deferential tone of an airport security guard or a customer service manager. It possessed the heavy, undeniable weight of federal law enforcement. I heard the distinct rustle of heavy fabric and the sharp clattering of walkie-talkies. Derek let out a pathetic, trembling stammer. He tried to project the arrogant authority he always used to intimidate lower-level employees at the firm. He demanded to know what was going on, claiming he was a highly respected commercial real estate executive trying to catch a flight. He threatened to call his lawyers and sue the airline for harassment. His voice was shaking so violently that the threats sounded like the desperate whining of a frightened child. The federal agent did not indulge his performance. The officer stated with absolute cold precision that they were executing a federal arrest warrant issued by the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agent loudly listed the charges right there in the middle of the crowded terminal: federal wire fraud, international money laundering, forgery of medical documents, conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement. Every single word was a devastating hammer blow, systematically shattering the fragile glass house Derek had built. I could hear the collective gasp of the surrounding passengers and the ticketing agents as the gravity of the situation became public knowledge. Derek was completely paralyzed. He could not run. He could not fight. He was trapped in a cage woven from his own unbridled greed. And then the most poetic and tragic moment of the entire morning unfolded. Megan, the woman who had stood on my front porch just 3 days ago with a smug smile of victory, realized that the luxury ship she had boarded was rapidly sinking to the bottom of the ocean. The moment she heard the federal agents list the severe criminal charges and saw the heavy metal handcuffs being unholstered, her loyalty evaporated into thin air. Without a single second of hesitation, she turned on her husband with the vicious ferocity of a cornered rattlesnake. Her shrill, panicked voice exploded through the phone line. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, desperately trying to distance herself from the radioactive fallout. She told the federal agents that she had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. She cried out that it was all Derek's idea, that he had forced her to go along with the plan, and that he was completely out of his mind. She threw him directly under the moving bus, rapidly exposing every single detail of his crimes to save her own skin. She confessed to the agents right there on the spot that Derek had bribed the doctor for the fake dementia diagnosis and that he had manipulated her brother into opening the Delaware Shell Company. She sobbed theatrically, claiming she was just a terrified wife acting under extreme emotional duress. The sheer toxicity of their marriage imploded in a matter of seconds. Derek, completely blindsided by his wife's instantaneous betrayal, let out a gut-wrenching scream of absolute fury. He cursed at her, calling her a traitor and a gold digger, reminding her loudly that she was the one who had happily packed her designer bags to flee to the Cayman Islands. He screamed that she was going to federal prison right alongside him. Their beautiful, flawless facade shattered into a million ugly pieces. They were no longer the wealthy elite couple of Dallas society. They were just two desperate criminals tearing each other apart in the middle of a public airport terminal, surrounded by armed federal agents and dozens of recording cell phones. The federal agents quickly grew tired of the domestic dispute. I heard the sharp metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs being tightly secured around my son's wrists. The cold click of the locking mechanism echoed through the phone line, a sound that represented the absolute and permanent end of his freedom. Another agent stepped in and began forcefully reading Derek his Miranda rights, the standard legal recitation drowning out his pathetic, breathless sobbing. He was crying like a broken child, his spirit utterly crushed beneath the weight of his own monumental hubris. Through the chaotic noise of Megan's hysterical screaming and the stern commands of the arresting officers, I heard Derek whimper one final desperate plea into the open phone line. He cried out for his dad, begging me to please wake up and tell them it was all a terrible dream. I stood in the silent hotel room, the morning sun now fully illuminating the space, and closed my eyes. There was no joy in my heart, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. The cancer had been entirely excised from my life. The poison was completely gone. I did not say another word. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, looked at the call timer, ticking on the glowing screen, and firmly pressed the red button. The nightmare was over for good. I breathed deeply. Finally. 3 months later, the oppressive heat of the Texas summer had finally begun to break, replaced by a crisp, unforgiving autumn breeze. I found myself sitting on a hard wooden bench inside the federal courthouse in downtown Dallas. The grand architecture of the courtroom, with its soaring ceilings and heavy mahogany paneling, felt like a fitting arena for the final act of this tragic play. I was dressed in my finest tailored suit, the same one I used to wear to board meetings when Derek was just a junior executive trying to impress me. I sat completely still, my posture straight, and my expression entirely unreadable. I was not there as a grieving father. I was there as the primary witness for the federal prosecution. The wheels of justice had turned with surprising speed, largely because the digital evidence captured by my poison pill protocol was absolutely irrefutable. The federal prosecutors did not have to build a complex narrative. Derek had handed them a perfectly wrapped gift containing every single detail of his massive conspiracy. The first head to roll had not belonged to my son, but to the corrupt neurologist who had confidently signed his name to my falsified dementia diagnosis. The doctor stood before the judge sweating profusely, looking nothing like the arrogant medical professional who had casually condemned a healthy man to an assisted living facility. The prosecutors systematically dismantled his entire career in less than an hour. They presented the financial records showing the massive cash bribes Derek had deposited into the doctor's offshore accounts. They brought in my primary care physician, who testified to my excellent cognitive health. The medical board did not hesitate. His license to practice medicine was permanently revoked on the spot, and he was immediately remanded into federal custody to await his own trial for criminal fraud and medical malpractice. Watching him being led away in handcuffs brought me no joy, only a profound sense of vindication. He had violated his sacred oath for a few pieces of silver, assuming an old man's life was a cheap commodity to be traded in the shadows. But the doctor was merely a stepping stone. The main event was the sentencing of the architect who had built this entire nightmare. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom swung open, and 2 armed federal marshals escorted my son into the room. Derek was completely unrecognizable. The expensive designer suits and the arrogant swagger had been entirely stripped away, replaced by the drab, humiliating reality of a shapeless orange prison jumpsuit. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes darting nervously around the room like a terrified animal. He looked incredibly small. When his eyes finally met mine across the crowded courtroom, I saw the desperate, silent plea for mercy reflecting in his hollow gaze. I did not blink. I did not look away. I simply stared back at him with the cold detachment of a stranger. The judge read the charges aloud, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Federal wire fraud, international money laundering, conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement. The judge noted the sheer malice of the crime, highlighting how Derek had weaponized the legal and medical systems to abuse his own elderly father. There was no leniency offered. The gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack. 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Ironically, the heavy walls of the federal prison were the only things protecting him from the violent shadow syndicate he still owed $12 million to. His life as he knew it was completely and permanently over. Megan, meanwhile, was fighting her own desperate battle across the aisle. She had filed for divorce the very morning after the airport arrest, aggressively attempting to rebrand herself as the innocent, victimized wife who had been completely manipulated by a tyrannical husband. She hired high-priced defense attorneys, pointing fingers and crying theatrically for the cameras outside the courthouse. But the federal prosecutors were incredibly thorough. They had traced the Delaware shell company directly back to her younger brother, and they found her digital signatures all over the fraudulent loan origination documents. Her desperate attempts to throw Derek under the bus had not saved her in the slightest. She was formally indicted as a primary criminal conspirator. The judge ordered her assets frozen and confiscated her passport. She sat at the defense table, her flawless makeup ruined by genuine tears of terror, realizing that her pristine country club life was about to be traded for a concrete cell. Her brother was already cooperating with the authorities, singing like a canary, to reduce his own sentence. The toxic alliance they had formed to destroy my life had completely devoured them from the inside out. As the proceedings finally concluded and the courtroom began to clear, the lead prosecutor walked over and shook my hand, thanking me for my stoic cooperation. I nodded, quietly gathered my coat, and walked out through the heavy wooden doors into the bright Texas afternoon. The air felt light. The crushing weight of the betrayal that had anchored me down for the last 3 months was finally gone. I walked down the wide granite steps of the courthouse, listening to the distant sounds of city traffic. I had survived the ultimate betrayal. I had successfully defended the empire I spent my entire life building. The rot had been completely excised from the foundation. The legal battles were officially behind me, and absolute justice had been served in the cold light of day. But as I stood on this pavement looking toward the horizon, I knew my work was not entirely finished. I still had to rebuild the future of my company and figure out exactly what to do with the massive wealth that was now entirely mine to control, free from the greedy hands of those who sought to steal it all away. The next chapter of my life was beginning to unfold. The very first thing I did after leaving the federal courthouse was reclaim the physical space that had been so maliciously stolen from me. I drove straight back to the custom-built estate, the very place where the locks had been changed, and my dignity had been so blatantly challenged on that bright morning. The heavy oak doors were unlocked this time. My legal team had already cleared out the remaining traces of Derek and Megan. I walked through the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. The house felt different now. The ghosts of their profound betrayal still lingered in the shadowed corners of the rooms, but the air felt remarkably clean and unburdened. I hired a professional crew to renovate the spaces they had occupied. I wanted absolutely no visual reminders of the people who had tried to erase my existence. I replaced the heavy brass locks once more, but this time I gave the spare keys only to the people who had actually earned my absolute trust. My loyal housekeeper, who had wept bitterly when she was falsely told I had been sent away to a facility, returned to her post with a warm embrace. The massive house transformed back into a welcoming home. It was no longer a fortress meant to shelter an ungrateful family. It was a peaceful sanctuary for myself. I spent the first few weeks simply enjoying the quiet rhythm of my own life. I woke up early, drank my coffee on the back patio, and watched the sunrise over the gardens my late wife had so carefully planted. The silence, which had once felt like a heavy burden in that sterile hotel room, now felt like a profound blessing. I had successfully defended the walls of my castle, and now I could finally enjoy the peace within them. With my personal life firmly secured, I turned my full attention back to the business empire. The twin South Dallas distribution centers, the very crown jewels that Derek had desperately tried to liquidate for a pathetic $15 million, were officially put back on the open commercial market. I did not rush the complex process. I let my experienced executive team conduct the proper environmental studies, the thorough structural inspections, and the endless legal negotiations. 4 months later, we successfully closed the deal with a massive multinational logistics firm for $29 million. It was a monumental financial victory, but the staggering amount of money no longer held the exact same meaning for me. I realized during those quiet nights in the hotel room that hoarding immense wealth for a bloodline that had turned completely rotten was nothing more than a fool's errand. I decided to build an entirely different kind of legacy. I took a highly significant portion of those real estate profits and established the Harrison Foundation. We created a comprehensive, fully funded entrepreneurial scholarship program dedicated entirely to underprivileged youth in the greater Dallas area. I wanted to find the brilliant young men and women who had the exact same relentless hunger and drive that I possessed when I was building my business from the dirt up. I wanted to give them the initial capital, the professional mentorship, and the critical resources they needed to successfully build their own empires. I now spend my afternoons reviewing their innovative business plans, listening to their ambitious, heartfelt pitches, and watching their tired eyes light up with genuine, undeniable hope. They were not waiting in the shadows for me to die so they could steal my money. They were incredibly eager to learn how to earn it themselves. It is an incredibly humbling experience to watch a young person's life change entirely because you simply chose to believe in their potential. I realized that my son's ultimate failure was not a reflection of my worth as a mentor, but a reflection of his own flawed character. Through their hard work, my legacy would continue to grow, planted firmly in soil that was actually capable of bearing good fruit. I also took the time to completely restructure the executive board of my commercial real estate company. I proudly promoted the hardworking men and women, who had stood by me during the darkest hours, the loyal employees who had bravely questioned the sudden chaotic changes when Derek had briefly seized control of the network. I rewarded their unwavering integrity with substantial equity shares and permanent leadership roles. Victor Bradley, my ruthless and brilliant attorney, who had engineered the digital trap, officially retired from his stressful private practice and joined my board as a senior executive advisor. We still drink terrible black coffee together in the mornings, but now we do it while discussing the bright future of the charitable foundation rather than plotting aggressive corporate warfare against my own flesh and blood. I learned through agonizing pain that the family you actively choose to build is often far stronger and more dependable than the family you are simply born into by total chance. I am 75 years old, but I feel a renewed sense of profound, unstoppable purpose. The mild stroke I suffered was a physical warning, but the devastating betrayal was a spiritual awakening. I no longer waste a single second of my precious time trying to appease or provide for people who only view me as a walking, breathing bank account. I protect my inner peace and my happiness with the exact same fierce, uncompromising intensity that I use to protect my financial assets. The storm that was meant to destroy me only cleared the path for a much better, brighter future. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. Sometimes the hardest thing a father has to do is let his child face the consequences of their own greed. Did you like my story? Do you think I went too far? Leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe. I will see you in the next story.